The Giants Before the Flood, a story that refuses to stay buried. Hook M.O. Dow. Before history was written, before kingdoms rose and fell, before the flood reshaped the face of the earth, there was a secret the Bible only whispers, a shadow moving behind the earliest pages of Scripture, a name spoken once and then never fully explained. The Nephilim. Every ancient civilization carries a memory it cannot quite explain. From Mesopotamia to Egypt, from Greece to far edges of the world, stories speak of giants, towering beings larger than life, stronger than men, feared like gods. They appear in myths, carvings, and half-forgotten legends. Some are heroes, some are monsters. All of them leave behind the same unsettling question: why does the whole world remember them? The Bible does not ignore this memory. It does not embellish it either. Instead, it records it briefly, almost reluctantly, as if revealing too much might awaken something better left undisturbed. In Genesis chapter 6, just a few verses before the flood, Scripture introduces a generation unlike any other, not merely sinful, not merely violent, but fundamentally corrupted. It says there were giants on the earth in those days, and something about their existence changed everything. This is not mythology. This is not fantasy. It is a warning. But before we journey back to the ancient world, before we speak of watchers, forbidden unions, and divine judgment, we must pause and look around us, because the most dangerous giants are not always the ones who tower over cities. Some giants cannot be seen at all. Fear that grips the heart at night, anxiety that whispers you are never enough, addiction that promises comfort but steals freedom, broken families, loneliness in crowded rooms, a quiet despair that settles into the soul and refuses to leave. These are the modern giants. And just like the giants of old, they shape civilizations, destroy homes, and distort what it means to be human. The same God who confronted the giants before the flood still confronts giants today. That is why this story matters. The account of the Nephilim is one of the most mysterious and controversial passages in the entire Bible. It raises uncomfortable questions. Who were the sons of God? Why did their actions provoke such a severe response from heaven? And why did God decide that the only solution was to cleanse the earth entirely? These questions have stirred debate for thousands of years. But the Bible does not present the Nephilim as a curiosity. It presents them as a line that was crossed, a boundary violated. And once crossed, the world could not remain the same. According to the ancient Hebrew understanding, the Nephilim were not simply large men or powerful warriors. Their name comes from a word meaning the fallen ones, not just fallen morally, but fallen from a higher place. Their existence represents a collision between heaven and earth that was never meant to happen. And when it did, violence multiplied, corruption spread, and humanity began to unravel. The flood was not random. It was not overreaction. It was a last act of mercy in a world spiraling beyond repair. Yet here is what makes this story so haunting. The Bible never says the temptation disappeared. The flood destroyed bodies, not desires. It wiped away flesh, not pride. It cleansed the earth, but the human heart remained a battlefield. And that is why echoes of the Nephilim appear again later in Scripture. Why giants resurface in the Promised Land. Why fear grips the spies of Israel centuries after flood. And why, even now, humanity still wrestles with the same ancient question. Will we live within God's boundaries, or will we reach beyond them, believing we know better? This story is not about ancient monsters. It is about order versus rebellion, humility versus power, obedience versus independence. It is about what happens when creation tries to redefine itself without the Creator. The Nephilim stand as a symbol of that rebellion, not just in size, but in spirit. They were giants not only in stature, but in arrogance and violence, and in their hunger to become more than they were designed to be. And that hunger still exists. As we move deeper into the story, we will return to the earliest pages of Genesis. We will examine who the sons of God were believed to be, what ancient Jewish writers understood about them, why their actions were seen as an assault on God's design, and how their offspring reshaped the world before the flood. We will explore why God chose Noah, why purity of lineage mattered, and why the ark was more than a vessel. It was a line of survival drawn through history. Because once you understand the origin of the Nephilim, you begin to understand the flood. And once you understand the flood, you begin to understand the spiritual battle that still surrounds humanity today. This is where the story truly begins. The origin, corruption, and judgment of the Nephilim. To understand why the flood was necessary, we must slow down and look carefully at what Scripture actually reveals and what it intentionally leaves unsaid. Genesis chapter 6 opens quietly. There is no thunder, no warning, just a simple statement. When mankind began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, at first glance, it sounds ordinary. Humanity is growing. Life continues. But then the tone changes. The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves whomever they chose. This single sentence is echoed through centuries of interpretation, debate, and fear. Who were these sons of God? The sons of God and the forbidden boundary. In the Hebrew Scriptures, the phrase sons of God is not vague. It appears elsewhere, most notably in the book of Job, and every time it refers to heavenly beings, not human men. Ancient Jewish readers did not see ambiguity here. They believed these were divine beings assigned to watch over creation, later called the Watchers. They were not created to rule. They were not created to reproduce. They were created to serve. But something went wrong. These beings looked upon humanity not with stewardship, but with desire. They crossed a boundary God had established, a boundary between heaven and earth, spirit and flesh. This was not romance. It was rebellion, and rebellion always disguises itself as curiosity first. The birth of the Nephilim. From this forbidden union came offspring that did not belong fully to either realm. Genesis gives them a name, Nephilim. The word carries a sense of fallen ones, but not merely fallen morally, fallen from a higher state of existence. These were not ordinary humans. They were larger, stronger, more dominant. Ancient texts described them as towering figures, overwhelming in presence and power. But physical size was only part of the problem. They were insatiable. According to the book of Enoch, they consumed everything, animals, crops, resources, until the earth itself groaned under the weight of their hunger. And when there was nothing left, they turned on humanity. Violence became systemic. Fear became normal. Survival replaced worship. What had once been a world shaped by God's word became a world shaped by brute force, forbidden knowledge, and the corruption of civilization. The Watchers did not only produce giants. They introduced ideas humanity was not ready to wield. They taught warfare, how to turn metal into weapons. They taught enchantments and sorcery. They taught astrology, divination, and manipulation of unseen forces. What appeared to be progress was actually poison. Knowledge divorced from wisdom always leads to destruction. Humanity began to see itself differently, no longer as created beings accountable to God, but as masters of their own destiny. Cities rose, altars were built, and the Nephilim were worshipped as gods. The earth was no longer merely sinful. It was fundamentally distorted, a world filled with violence. Genesis summarizes this era with chilling simplicity. The earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. Violence was not an exception. It was the culture. Power determined truth. Strength replaced righteousness. Life became cheap. Families were broken. Women were taken. Kings ruled through terror. And above it all stood the Nephilim, embodiment of unchecked desire, domination, and pride. This was not evolution upward. This was decreation. The image of God in humanity was being overwritten. God's grief and the weight of divine sorrow. Then Scripture says something almost unbearable. The Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. This is not divine weakness. It is divine heartbreak. God does not grieve because he loses control. He grieves because love has been rejected. Every imagination of the human heart had turned continually toward evil, not occasionally, not partially, continually. The world had reached a point of no return. And so a decision was made, not out of rage, but out of justice mingled with mercy. Noah, a line preserved. In the middle of this darkness, one name appears like a quiet candle in a storm. Noah. Scripture says Noah found favor with God. He was righteous in his generation. This does not mean he was perfect, but he was uncompromised. While the world was being corrupted physically, spiritually, and morally, Noah remained intact. His lineage was pure. His faith was intact. God's plan for humanity would pass through him. When Noah built the ark, he was not just preparing for rain. He was participating in the preservation of creation itself. The ark was not escape. It was obedience. The flood, judgment and mercy intertwined. When the waters came, they came from above and below. As the creation itself were undoing what had been twisted, the giants fell. The watchers were judged. The corrupted world was washed clean. Everything that breathed outside the ark perished. This was judgment, but it was also mercy, because unchecked evil does not heal itself. It spreads. The flood was not the end of hope. It was a reset that made hope possible. The spirits that remained. But the story does not end with the waters receding. Ancient Jewish writings suggest something unsettling, that while the bodies of Nephilim were destroyed, their spirits remained, neither fully angel nor fully human. They were left without place or rest. They became what later Scripture would call unclean spirits, restless, seeking habitation. Whether taken literally or symbolically, the message is clear. Rebellion leaves echoes, and some consequences outlive the rebellion itself. After the flood, the giants return. Generations later, Israel stands on the edge of the promised land. Spies return with fear in their voices. We saw the Nephilim there, and we were like grasshoppers in our own sight. How could this be? The Bible offers few details, but history repeats the pattern. Giants appear again. The Anakim, the Rephaim, Goliath of Gath, and once again, God's message remains unchanged. Do not fear them. Joshua defeats them. David brings one down with a stone. What pride exalts, faith humbles. What the giants truly represent. The Nephilim were never just about size. They represent what happens when power goes unchecked, when knowledge lacks wisdom, when creation seeks independence from its creator. They are the embodiment of humanity's oldest temptation, to become like gods without God. And that temptation did not drown in the flood. It followed humanity into every generation. As the giant of flesh fade from Scripture, the giants of influence remain. Pride, violence, control, fear. The stage is now set for the final question this story forces us to ask, not about ancient beings, but about ourselves. Because the Nephilim are gone, but the choice that created them still stands. The Nephilim's end, and the choice that still remains. As the giants fade from the pages of Scripture, something curious happens. The Bible grows quiet. There are no dramatic epilogues, no lingering descriptions of their extinction, no celebration of their fall. The Nephilim simply disappear. Their cities crumble. Their bloodlines dissolve. Their names vanish from the record. And yet, the silence is not empty. Because Scripture is not concerned with preserving monsters, it is concerned with preserving meaning. The disappearance of the Nephilim is not the end of their story. It is the moment their story becomes a mirror. Where did the Nephilim go? After the time of David. The word Nephilim never appears again in the Bible. Some scholars believe they were entirely destroyed. Others believe their remnants were absorbed into surrounding peoples. Still others suggest their memory survived only through distorted legends and myths. Around the world, stories of giant beings continue to surface. Massive stone structures with no clear explanation. Ancient ruins built on impossible scales. Legends from distant cultures that never touched Israel, yet echo the same themes. Were these remnants of a lost age, or simply the result of human ingenuity and imagination? Scripture does not answer, and that silence is intentional, because the Bible is not trying to convince us that giants once existed. It is trying to warn us why they existed in the first place. The true legacy of the Nephilim. The Nephilim were not remembered because of their height. They were remembered because they represented something deeply broken. They were the result of boundaries crossed, of power taken instead of received, of knowledge pursued without wisdom, of desire elevated above obedience. In that sense, the Nephilim never truly vanished. Their legacy did not survive in flesh. It survived in temptation. The temptation to redefine good and evil. The temptation to control rather than trust. The temptation to become like gods without God. That temptation lives on. Giants without bodies. Today, the giants no longer walk among us in physical form, but they tower in other ways. They appear as systems that reward corruption, as technologies that outpace morality, as cultures that glorify violence and call it progress, as voices that say truth is flexible and power determines meaning. These are the modern Nephilim, not beings of flesh, but of influence. They shape how people think, how nations operate, how value is assigned to life. And just like before the flood, they promise advancement while quietly hollowing out the soul. The battle has shifted. In the ancient world, the battlefield was physical. Giants ruled through strength. Fear was enforced by size. Oppression was visible. Today, the battlefield is internal. It exists in the mind, in desire, in identity. The war that began before the flood continues, not on mountaintops, but in thought patterns, not with weapons of iron, but with ideas. And that is why this story still matters. Noah's choice, our choice. Noah lived in a world that rewarded corruption. He was surrounded by violence, by mockery, by temptation. Yet Scripture says he walked with God. He did not argue with the culture. He did not dominate it. He simply refused to become like it. The ark was built long before the rain fell. Day after day, Noah chose obedience when it made no sense, faith when there was no evidence, trust when the world laughed. That choice saved humanity, and that choice still stands before us. David and the pattern of faith. Centuries later, a shepherd boy stood before a giant. Goliath represented everything the Nephilim spirit celebrates: size, intimidation, power, pride. David represented something different: faith, humility, dependence on God. He did not defeat the giant by becoming bigger. He defeated the giant by trusting deeper. Every victory over a giant in Scripture follows the same pattern: the power of God moving through obedience, not domination. Christ, the true Son of God. The story of the Nephilim begins with false sons of God crossing boundaries in rebellion. The Bible ends with the true Son of God crossing boundaries in redemption. Jesus did what the Watchers could not. He united heaven and earth, not through corruption, but through righteousness, not through force, but through sacrifice, not by taking power, but by laying it down. Where the Nephilim distorted humanity, Christ restores it. Where they brought judgment, he brings grace. Colossians tells us that through the cross, Christ disarmed the powers and authorities, exposing them, triumphing over them. The giants lost not because of another flood, but because of a resurrection. The giants within. If the Nephilim teach us anything, it is this: the greatest threat to humanity has never been external monsters. It has always been internal pride, the desire to rule instead of serve, to know everything instead of trust, to be self-sufficient instead of surrendered. Every person carries giants within: fear that paralyzes, pride that blinds, addiction that chains, shame that whispers you are beyond redemption. These giants are real, but they are not invincible. Faith is still the stone. David did not defeat Goliath with strength. He defeated him with faith. Noah did not survive the flood with power. He survived it with obedience. And Christ did not conquer death with force. He conquered it with surrender. The pattern has never changed. Faith is still the stone that brings giants down. The final question. So the story of Nephilim leaves us with a question. Not, did giants really exist? But what kind of people will we become? Will we chase power without wisdom, knowledge without humility, freedom without obedience? Or will we walk with God, even when it feels out of step with the world? The Nephilim chose rebellion. Noah chose faith. And history was shaped by that choice. The story that still speaks. The flood washed away the giants, but it did not erase a lesson. Every generation stands where Noah once stood. Every heart faces the same decision. Will we build arks of faith in corrupt times, or blend in until truth disappears? The Nephilim fell, but the faithful still stand. And that is the story Scripture wants us to remember. Not the giants who rule for a moment, but the God who reigns forever.